Good evening, and welcome to the Hollywood Babylonians.
Hello, friends. This is your happy Hollywood history host, Mr. Ben Burke, here with another episode of the Hollywood Babylonians, your favorite Hollywood history podcast in which we discuss the greatest films of old Hollywood and the history behind them. And today, I have with me my brilliant friend and co-host back, Mr. Garrett McPherson, to talk about the history behind Manchurian Candidates as we prepare to talk about John Frankenheimer's 1962 political thriller, The Manchurian Candidate, from United Artists, starring Frank Sinatra, Lawrence Harvey, Angela Lansbury, Janet Leigh, and Henry Silva. How are you, Garrett?
I am well. Glad to be back.
That's good. You look like you're well. You look like you were well rested on this Saturday afternoon. So I have brought Garrett on because he loves history so much, as I've talked about before, to talk about the history behind Manchurian Candidates and how they were used in United States of America's history. We were talking a little bit about the Cold War last time. I'm sure they really filter into that somehow. So I would just like for you to tell me all about Manchurian Candidates.
Cool. Yeah. It was a interesting rabbit hole to go down, to say the least. Because I, as a podcast listener to myself, I've listened to a lot of true crime podcasts and a lot of conspiracy theory podcasts. Mm-hmm. And so this, it is a fun, anything with CIA, Cold War, mind control type stuff.
Yes.
Very quickly can devolve into some dudes with bulletin boards, putting up a bunch of red string, trying to connect the dots. But it was really interesting, just kind of going into what the origin of some of these things are. And before we start off, I'll say my main source, the book that I will reference a lot and went through is called The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. The CIA and Mind Control, The Secret History of the Behavioral Sciences, and that's by John Marks. And John Marks is a journalist who basically in the, I believe, late 60s, early 70s, kind of went to war with the CIA over some of their classified just practices. And basically in 74, I believe it was, when the Freedom of Information Act was passed, mm-hmm. Basically the CIA had to release a bunch of records, and that's where his work came out of. So they released a bunch of records. A lot of them were redacted. They blotted out a lot of names, and there's still a lot we don't know because there was a lot that was destroyed. Mm-hmm. But he did a lot of work looking into specifically the CIA's history with brainwashing, mind control, interrogation tactic type things. And so that's what that book, the scope of that book, kind of covers. As I went through and trying to look for a place to start, I didn't really find much like academic style books about like the Russians and mind control on the communist side. Mm-hmm. As much as I did on the U.S. side. And probably part of that is because we have the Freedom of Information Act, and we have a lot more. There are a lot of things that happen in the shadows, but we have access to just some knowledge that some other places don't. I will say one of the things that came up was that during the Korean War, there were documented cases of American and European prisoner of war captives being captured and then indoctrinated and brainwashed. So that, which is the beginning of the movie, right, isn't totally far-fetched. Mm-hmm. There was a book written I've got it in my notes here, in 1953 by a reporter named Robert J. Lifton, mm-hmm. Called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. And basically he interviewed 25 American and European POWs and 15 Chinese citizens who had defected, and basically it was an account of Chinese indoctrination and interrogation tactics, which were kind of chemical brainwashing type tactics to try to get what they could out of their prisoner of war and citizens, and also in some cases there were Americans who defected to the Chinese Communist side during the Korean War.
Okay.
And the U.S. there was a lot of from Chinese propaganda side and North Korean propaganda side, and some of it may have been true. I mean, it's who knows, but they did accuse the U.S. of using biological warfare, and so there were some United States servicemen who confessed to using germ gas and things like that. And what the U.S. government said was, well, those Chinese communists, they brainwash everybody. So you can't take those confessions seriously. So I mean, it's kind of a very fluid situation, because then in 1956 the U.S. Army put out a commission. They were like, they didn't do any brainwashing. So we kind of play both sides of that coin. Oh yeah, they did. Right. We didn't use nerve gas. And then you're like, well, maybe they didn't. Kind of started with that rabbit hole of the Chinese and Soviets using some thought reform practices and brainwashing techniques. That was used as a justification for what the CIA and the U.S. government started a project called MK Ultra, which is where we really get into the conspiracy theory.
I was going to ask about it. I was like, is this going to all lead up into like Stranger Things MK Ultra? Yeah,
it does. It really does. And there were things in World War II to say MK Ultra is the beginning, the genesis of American intelligence dabbling in psychological warfare type things wouldn't be true. There were some things in World War II that the OSS at the time, the predecessor to the CIA, did practice some psychological warfare techniques like brainwashing. Basically, at that point, everything's kind of in its infancy, where they were trying to figure out how they could interrogate people and get the most out of them. So there were things like the OSS had what was called the Truth Drug Committee, which was in 1943. So they were investigating ways to get captives and people that they were interrogating to tell them more information. So what they used, the first chemical they used, because that's kind of the road all of this goes down, is some of it's like psychological torture, but the most effective, which is a very effective way that they found. But probably the most of the science and stuff that we look at, and I think probably find more interesting, is the drug-induced stuff. Yeah. And that's kind of the thing with MK Ultra. You've got LSD and heroin, like just a lot of crazy stuff. So the OSS Truth Drug Committee, the first thing they used was cannabis indica, so a strain of marijuana. They found that it was really useful in loosening people's lips, which, I guess in like 1944 New Jersey, someone who's never used marijuana is like, I'll tell you everything. Right. But an interesting thing that I noticed that was noted in the book I read was that one of the things that they did early on in this Truth Drug Committee was they paired up with the Manhattan Project. And the reason was, a lot of people there were like, we don't know why, but they were drugging members of the Manhattan Project. And the reason being was because what the Manhattan Project was working on was the top secret thing. And while they knew about it, if they could get them to confess things that were the highest clearance confidentiality, well, then it's working.
That makes sense.
Another example was there was a member of the mafia. His last name was Del Gracio. He basically was this really hardcore mafia guy in New York and New Jersey. He bragged about killing people for like ratting people out and things like that. And basically there was a guy in the OSS who laced a cigarette with marijuana and gave it to him. And the guy just started talking. He was like, you can't use any of this. But he just started talking like this, Tony Soprano type, just real big, bad guy. And he just starts spouting.
Yes.
So that's kind of the genesis of where the American government was like, maybe this is something we should look into.
Right.
And then at the end of World War II, when it became at the Nuremberg trials for Nazi war crimes and things like that, as it became clearer what was happening in concentration camps and in Japan, it kind of, and we talked about this with Dr. Strangelove as well, right, with Operation Paperclip and taking a lot of science from the Nazis.
Yes.
Basically, what the Nazis had done during World War II was they had a lot of experiments with mescaline, which is also called peyote, and kind of they were exploring like what can we do with drugs to
right,
weaken the human psyche. So that kind of led to what was first called Operation Bluebird, and then Operation Artichoke, which were the immediate predecessors to MK Ultra. But the stated goal of Operation Artichoke, there was a memo, and I'll read it to you. It's a quote. This memo was in January of 1952. The stated goal was, can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and even against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation, which is literally the idea of a Manchurian candidate.
Right.
Can we get someone to do something totally against their will, whether they want to or not? Because conventional thought at the time was that even if you hypnotize someone to do something, deep down they wanted to do it. You can't get someone to do something that they wouldn't normally do or couldn't be suggested to do. Yeah, so that was Operation Artichoke was when they first kind of started using LSD, which was first synthesized in 1938, but then about 5 years later was when they discovered the psychedelic properties of LSD, which is kind of a funny story. This guy, Albert Hoffman, who's a Swiss scientist, was hanging out in his lab doing science and stuff and accidentally dosed himself with LSD and just starts tripping out. So he's sitting there, just trying to accidentally dosing himself with LSD. And so, yeah, Operation Artichoke led to the U.S. purchasing the entire world supply of LSD for $240,000, which is a lot of money at the time.
Yeah.
And basically morphed into MK Ultra, where the CIA and the US government did just a lot of experiments on a lot of people who didn't know. It started out with a lot of, they would go to like prostitutes and drug addicts. And there were people who did consent to what the experiments were. But they found that with this kind of psychological experimentation, if someone came into it consenting, it eliminated a breaking point to some degree, because they would always know that they were safe and weren't going to die. Right. And so they started transforming into what was called terminal experimentation, which was basically, we're going to take this as far as we can without killing the person and without them knowing. Because if they think they're in real danger, then we can take them as far as we want to go, and how that would be in a practical application. There are some crazy stories of just, they would dose CIA agents without them knowing. There's one story of a guy who got his coffee dosed in the morning and then ends up just running around DC screaming because he thinks there's monsters in every car. Like, it's what a wild time to be alive. And then also, like, a lot of universities were funded to do LSD research. So you got like guys like Allen Ginsberg and I don't remember his name now, but the guy who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, like a lot of writers and a lot of and musicians too. Jerry Garcia from the Grateful Dead, who were involved with MK Ultra because they were in these schools and colleges that they were in experimental trials to try LSD. and so it really did shape the way kind of the US pop culture even developed in the late 60s and the 50s. The guy who was in charge of MK Ultra was named Sidney Gottlieb, and he was the one who kind of changed it from like interrogation tactics to looking and saying, we may be able to use this as a means of warfare. So they were trying to develop chemicals that they could use because LSD had such short-term effects. They were like, well, if we could use this, if we could slip somebody LSD, if we could slip a Fidel Castro LSD in the middle of a big meeting, it may cause him to go erratic, and we can use that to our advantage. So they would do things like that. They also would try to do things. There were a lot of tests to try to develop a chemical to make Fidel Castro's beard fall out and like emasculate him. Not all of it was like trying to just brainwash people. Some of it was just trying to embarrass them to where they lose their cool and have a psychotic breakdown. There was a story about World War II where they looked. It was an explosive chemical, but it was very sweet. It tasted very sweet, and it wouldn't explode unless you had a charge. The OSS played around with it, and they asked what a Japanese soldier, like, what's the most embarrassing thing we can do to a Japanese soldier? And it was like, well, if they get diarrhea, like, it's like totally shameful. So they gave this chemical, made it smell and look like diarrhea, and gave it to Chinese kids and told them to go and spray it on Japanese soldiers walking around so they'd think they'd soil themselves. This is where your tax dollars are going to, you know?
It just seems childish.
Yeah, it is. It truly is. Like, the ethics of it are not good. And it truly is just kind of a playground to see what's going on. And there are very drastic effects and very deadly effects. There was one high profile case. He was an American Army chemist named Frank Olson, who had worked in MK Ultra and basically looked and said, I don't think this is ethical. And he wanted out. And then he had never tried LSD. He had never been dosed. And then he had a meeting with Sidney Gottlieb and was covertly dosed with LSD. And then 9 days later, he basically had a psychotic break. It sent him into a deep depression, and he jumped out of the window and died.
I've heard that. Wasn't it like a hotel window or something?
I think it was a hotel. So there's debate whether it was homicide or whether it was, it was led by the LSD. In like the late 90s, I saw, or maybe it was the early 2000s, his estate and his family did win a court case because basically a coroner, they exhumed his body. And he was like, there's brain damage there that obviously showed that he was unconscious before he fell out the window. So it was ruled then as a homicide. But yeah, that's kind of where it all went to is this mind control, LSD, bright shining lights, just trying to break down a human being and get them to do what you want them to do. And there's like there are just some crazy stories. Have you ever heard of Operation Midnight Climax?
No, I haven't. But have I had several? Yes. Keep going.
Okay, well, so Operation Midnight Climax there were a bunch of safe houses in San Francisco for the CIA, and they set up these brothels. So it's these brothels run by the CIA. And when the Johns would come in, the clients, right? Because they knew this was something that word wouldn't leak, because if they were like, something happened when I went to the brothel, people were like, you went to a brothel? So they would drug them with LSD and then just watch through one-way mirrors to see what happened. And this went on for a while.
Oh, no.
They were just drugging people who were, paying for a good time. So yeah, I mean, eventually the CIA would abandon LSD because it was a little bit erratic, like it wasn't working. And there were now things called super hallucinogenics. Like there was a chemical called BZ that they used. They tried hypnosis, which is kind of what happens in the Manchurian Candidate, right? Like it's a hypnosis. They're not really clear how they do it in the Manchurian Candidate, which I thought was interesting. Because I just, after doing some research, trying to see if there's any way that they do this conditioning. I will say there is it's almost a throwaway line where the Chinese guy says, we let them smoke and these alternative goofy cigarettes or whatever he says. And I wouldn't have caught that, but knowing that LSD and marijuana were big parts of it, I was like, I think that's a wink wink reference to marijuana. Yes. I might be wrong, but I think it is.
No, I think it is, because they keep talking about their special cigarettes. So much to unpack in that one dream, really. Because he has the one man that's leading it, who is apparently also leading a garden party, has very, very long, kind of intricate monologues that, I almost need to go back and read the screenplay to fully understand everything he's talking about. But I think most of the audience is so distracted with the meta universe that they have created by brainwashing all of these army men.
It's so well done. It's so well, and I love the idea in the film too of when you have the black soldier, it's a fully black.
I know.
Lobby. It's so well thought out that is in this guy's mind. Like, yeah, that's who he populates it with.
Right.
Which there's a lot of things in this film that are brilliant. And I mean, that even leads to the history, because obviously Eisner's his name, right? Or am I butchering it? The senator.
Iceland.
Okay. Iceland.
Yes.
I don't know why I couldn't remember it.
No,
he is based on Joseph McCarthy.
Yes, that makes sense.
They even call it Icelandism. And you're like, yeah, McCarthyism. Okay,
and he has no idea what he's doing. The whole thing is being run by Angela Lansbury, which is brilliant too. I mean, who else to run a giant communist conspiracy theory other than Angela Lansbury?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say one thing. I mean, because I was going to ask you, they never completely fully explain how they brainwashed all these people, how they hypnotized Raymond Shaw, Lawrence Harvey into being like a homicidal, to being their hitman, to being the government's hitman. But I feel like the point, like John Frankenheimer was trying to make it was like, it doesn't matter how they hypnotized him. What matters is that the entire thing is connected to the highest of the highest in the United States government.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a big, and that kind of led to that paranoia was one of the things I was reading that led to why something like MK Ultra was allowed to happen, because you had people in the highest seats of government who were convinced that there were moles in the US government, that they were convinced that in the highest seats of power, there were communists, that there were people who were on the inside. And it was this widespread paranoia that led to, and it is an interesting thing in the film, because I guess, like, what is the message? Because watching it now, like, you look at something like Senator Iceland and you're like, he's a buffoon. Like, he has he's not speaking the truth.
Right.
But he is speaking the truth, because Shaw's mother is obviously a communist.
Yeah, she's the one who's the communist that's controlling everything.
Yeah. So it's like, it is like, what is the, it's not like Dr. Strangelove, where it's like this whole thing is blown out of proportion a little bit, but it's scary.
Yeah.
It's more like, yeah, it exists, but it's not who we think it is. You know, like it's just brilliant. And there's even some things you could talk about with like the 1960 U-2 spy plane incident with Gary Powers. Have you ever?
I haven't.
Do you know what happened with that?
You want to explain that to all of us? What happened with that?
So Gary Powers was a U.S. pilot who was shot down, I think, over Ukraine in 1960 in a U-2 spy plane. The issue was that at that time, the U.S. wasn't supposed to be flying missions over Soviet airspace. So he got shot down. Protocol was that if the planes were shot down, they were supposed to self-destruct the plane and kill themselves so that the U.S. could, divert responsibility. Gary Powers didn't do it. He didn't kill himself. And it ended up spending some time in a Soviet prison. And eventually there was a prisoner trade. If you've ever seen the movie Bridge of Spies that came out a few years ago with Tom Hanks, that's about the exchange of Gary Powers. But when Gary Powers got back, there was a real concern. One, it was complicated because a lot of people thought he should have killed himself, and it was the unpatriotic thing to do to stay alive. So there was a lot of, he had a really rough life after he got back, just public perception. But there was also concern and fear that he was now a sleeper agent turned by the Soviet government. You can even look at theories about like Lee Harvey Oswald, because he spent some time in Cuba and Russia, and comes back to the US and then assassinates Kennedy. And so it's like you have, and another, if you look up Manchurian Candidate just on YouTube and go down that rabbit hole, there are also some conspiracies about Sirhan, who was the assassin for Bobby Kennedy. He was a highly suggestible person, very susceptible to hypnosis and just suggestion. And there's conspiracy theories that he's like a Manchurian Candidate. So, this movie came out in 1962. Kennedy's killed in 63. Bobby Kennedy is killed in 68. You know, so you can see how in the 10 years after this film, there's some concern about this reality for a lot of people.
Right. Well, and it's like one thing I was going to say, it's like I was just watching The Crown, of course, because of what just happened in our current reality. But the prime minister that I think came to power in 64, 65, they were very much concerned that he was a communist, that he was going to infiltrate the government, and it ended up being the art collector that lived at the palace. I can't remember his name. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Don't know.
Okay, well, we can cut this out. But
I can't think of the name.
But also, like you were talking about, like 62, 63, Kennedy was killed, and then 68, his brother was killed, and then in 65, investigative journalist she was a gossip reporter, Dorothy Kilgallen. You might have heard of. She was on the panel of What's My Line, and she was investigating JFK's death. And when she was investigating JFK's death and she was going to publish it, I think in her news publication, I can't remember what that was, she said to one of her best friends, Arlene Francis, who was on the What's My Line panel, she said, when I publish this is going to blow the JFK case wide open. And at that time, a mysterious man that she supposedly fell madly in love with showed up in her life. Nobody on the What's My Line panel met him. None of her family, none of her friends ever met him. And she just talked about him a lot. And people saw him from distances far away, but they never saw him. And then mysteriously, she committed suicide. And this giant file of papers that had been compiled over JFK's death disappeared with this mystery man.
Scary stuff, man.
I know.
Yeah, that's nuts. Like, and it does pervade kind of the rest of the Cold War, at least, this fear that there are Russians among us, you know. We see it, and it's not to say brainwashing doesn't exist, like in an indoctrination type way.
Yes.
Because you look at, do you know the story of Patty Hearst?
Yeah.
She was like a socialite. Yeah, she was kidnapped, and then ended up joining her kidnappers. So a little Stockholm syndrome.
Right, exactly.
But there's that. Even the Manson stuff. Like, people look at Manson and you know, cults in general. You start talking about psychology and things like that, you know, from the 60s onward, our country in particular has had just a problem with cults, you know, and just like really, they became really prominent. And, you know, you want to talk about brainwashing and things like that. And I think that's kind of more the reality we run into, is just indoctrination.
Right. Well, and you could even make the case that Manson brainwashed his followers with LSD and marijuana.
Yeah, and actually led to murders, right?
Right, like exactly.
Maybe the closest thing we have to a Manchurian. It's not go play solitaire and then go mad,
right?
But it's something where, you know, a person will totally believe something to such an extreme state.
Exactly.
Not necessarily making this robot super soldier get smart Jaime kind of character, but. Yeah, it's really fascinating. I'm just struck by the film and how contemporary it looks at times. One of my favorite shots of any film, I think, ever is the one in Congress at the beginning where he's screaming, and it's got the television set, and you can see the television set and then the live action. I love that scene and that sequence.
Oh, and it's brilliant. And you have so many things going on, and you're watching. I keep coming back to Angela Lansbury because she just makes your skin crawl. But she's sitting there watching the whole thing happen because she's orchestrated this entire thing. And I never noticed it before until I was watching it again today. She starts rubbing her hands together. She has these black gloves on, so she has no fingerprints on any of this, but she's orchestrating the entire event.
Gosh, it's so tragic too.
Yeah.
It's crazy too that they take a character like Shaw, who is just terrible. Like, he is impossible to like.
Right.
But at the end, you look and they make him a character who can be loved, so we sympathize with him. And then he kills Josie and her father, and then they redeem him at the end, and you feel bad. You know,
I know.
You feel bad.
It's sad. I mean, but yeah, I think the most exciting few minutes in film history, from my perspective, is the ending of The Manchurian Candidate, which I can barely. I could not sit still the first time I watched it because I had no idea. I mean, if you sit still and you calm yourself down, you can kind of figure out what's going to happen. But I wasn't about to do that.
And the acting is so good too. Like it's also very contemporary acting wise. The only thing that I have, the only two sequences that I feel like, and I'm like, is the nightmare scenes, because but it's also 1960 where they're like, I'm having a nightmare.
Right. Exactly. When they wake up from their nightmare, screaming. I mean, they had to show it some way, because when I wake up from a nightmare, I don't sit up screaming. I mean, I might if I had nightmares like that.
Intense. Just intense.
Yes.
But yeah, really, really interesting stuff.
So do you know Manchuria? Do you know where this name came from? Manchurian Candidate. Like, why did they call it Manchurian Candidate?
I think part of that is it probably comes from what we were talking about with the Korean War, because Manchuria is a area in China right across the Korean border. And so I think it's right across. But I think that's where that comes from is this idea of Chinese communist involvement in the Korean War, and like Manchuria being, the closest, or maybe it's just a remote part of China. I should know more about that. But I think that's where it comes from. And these, because like I said, in the 50s, there were already thoughts and books being written about Chinese brainwashing and indoctrination. So I think that's where that comes from, because you have the Korean War, and it's more of we haven't gone to war with the Russians. So I think it's just something to frame. I don't know. I think it's almost a framing device because of where the Korean War happened and what we suspected with Chinese involvement being kind of in the covert secret warfare type thing.
Was it suspect that many American soldiers during the Korean War were practiced on, as Raymond Shaw was?
Yeah, I don't think it was to that extent. Actually, I in that book I was talking about by Robert Lifton, called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism? Yeah, totalism. One of the things that was noted was soldiers that were indoctrinated as soon as they got back to the U.S. and started living a normal life, the indoctrination fell. So it's very much a environmental, like, external stimuli state, which when you want to talk about cults, that's also something we know, is that once you get people out of the isolated cult environment, they adjust pretty well. I mean, there's obviously trauma there, but they start to come back to earth. So it wasn't I won't say it wasn't a concern, because I do think there was paranoia, but from an academic standpoint of like the people we know that were kidnapped and or captured and practiced on, they came back, and I don't think they thought that they were going to be playing cards and then go kill a senator, So but there obviously was that concern, you had that concern with people like Lee Harvey Oswald, who went defected, and they were like, what happened to him in Russia? What happened to him in Cuba? So I won't say there wasn't a founded concern, because there was some paranoia about it, but I think it wasn't to the extreme that is in the movie of like, it worked. And that's something that they actually point out in the book I was reading, the main book, Search for the Manchurian Candidate. They were like, we're actually pretty lucky this didn't work, because if they had been really successful, we could live in a totally different world, because they could have killed who they wanted when they wanted, and you wouldn't know.
Well, and we might be living in that totally different world, because
we might be living in that reality.
that person that they did kill was JFK. Who knows?
Yeah. Lee Harvey Oswald was a patsy, man.
Exactly. And so is RFK. That's the reason they keep dying, is because we're living in that totally different world.
Yeah.
That's one thing that I need to look into, is like reading the book, because it's based on a book by...
Yeah, it's based on the book, yeah.
Right.
Well, and I was trying to look and see like what was the basis for the book. Because I was like, is there some kind of true something?
The book is written as a 1959 novel by Richard Condon. Okay, so it was allegedly plagiarized.
I saw that.
Yeah. From Robert Graves' 1934 novel I, Claudius. And forensic linguist John Olson judged that there can be no disputing that Richard Condon plagiarized from Robert Graves, that this is plagiarized from a 1934 novel. And apparently stuff like this was going on long before the Korean War.
Yeah, I guess we thought so. Yeah, I think, well, and that's what's interesting to me is that we didn't know a lot of what was happening until the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And so this movie, sometimes watching it, feels like, man, this was a very accurate guess. You know what I mean? Like, that's what kind of makes me feel weird. Like, I'm looking up I, Claudius right now, and it's about the assassination of Caesar.
So is this really a great Shakespearean tale?
I think so.
I think it plays a lot in that. And I mean, you look at this from what we talked about with Strangelove coming out of World War II. There's a lot of this stuff like building up, whether it was atomic bombs and spies and people, Manchurian candidates being brainwashed. And then all of a sudden in the early 60s, there were these political thrillers that, well, they were written as books in the late 50s first. And then the early 60s, these political thrillers started coming out where there was this kind of deconstruction of this American nuclear family way of life, being like, you know, America is not the Mayberry, North Carolina that you think it is. You know, it's actually, there's a lot of darker things that are going on.
And it's crazy to me because I remember we talked about this with Strangelove too, is that what people knew at the time versus what was suspected and what they wrote about. Because when we talked about Strangelove, I think we had a very similar thing of like, how did they get it so right? And how did they guess so well when so much of it was under wraps, when so much of it hadn't happened yet, you know? And just the pulse the finger on the pulse that I feel like some of these movies and books and just writings, pop culture things have on what the situation actually was and how nervous people were. Because it's, with this mind control stuff, I mean, the idea was you could topple governments because you had sleeper cells and sleeper agents, and it's still something we sit with, and it's still something that happens. As I was looking through it, it's not a mind control thing, but there was in the early, or maybe it was the 2010s, there was a sleeper ring of Russian spies that were captured in the U.S. because they weren't assassinating people, but they were living their lives here in the U.S. And we found out that they were Russian operatives. And I remember maybe 15 years ago, I remember there was a Russian spy who was poisoned, and it was a big news. It's kind of in the back of my brain. I couldn't find the story on it, but it was a big story around, the size of like the Casey Anthony trial, things like that, where I was like too young to understand what was going on, but the images are there in my head.
So even though Mr. Gorbachev took down that wall, there are still people from the Kremlin that are trying to infiltrate our system.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Okay.
Are you a Manchurian candidate, Ben?
Who knows? I mean, you've known me long enough to probably know the answer to that, which is yes.
I can imagine you playing solitaire and that Red Queen just
I know, that Red Queen. And I mean, I was thinking also about, as I was watching it earlier, like it was the Queen that set him off every single time. Like, what an interesting choice that the Queen set him off.
When they talk about that a little bit, he's like, he's got mommy issues.
He does. Oh, yeah. And that's why he's such an unlovable character, is because his mother never loved him. She's such an unlovable character.
And then that shot where Josie shows up in the Red Queen, or in the Red Queen outfit, I'm like, this is some real Freudian type stuff going on here.
We're just getting deeper and deeper and deeper in a way that Hollywood had never seen before.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Big Oedipus complex. Big Oedipus complex for this guy. And in the book, I read in the book, that's what happens is he actually, his mother forces him to have sex with her when he's under hypnosis, under the brainwashing thing.
Well, and that one of the last scenes where Angela Lansbury gives that monologue to Lawrence Harvey, the subtext of the scene was that, there was a lot more going on there with Lawrence Harvey and between mother and son than they ever put on screen, just from that one kiss.
Yeah,
between
I
mother
read
and son.
about that. Yeah,
And I recently saw an interview with Angela Lansbury where, he had to sit completely still for the entire time. And she said he had, I think it was pneumonia or bronchitis, had a temperature of 105. So he had to sit for the entire shot, just completely still. And I would have been like, I don't want to kiss him if he has a temperature of 105.
No, thank you.
No. Oh,
I will say, when I started the movie and I was like, she's his mother, there's no way they're more than, I guess, 10 years apart. But she's 3, right?
Well, I think, it was just 3. And it was, from the thing about Angela Lansbury, she was playing middle-aged women from the time she signed her contract at MGM in 1943,
Yeah.
And she did it
and
well.
I'm sure you'll get into that more in the breakdown episode. But I saw that. I was like, there's no way. And it's always watching. There's the scene where they're in the lobby and there's the young soldier, and they were like, he looks a little young to be in your army, doesn't he?
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, he looks the perfect age. You all look too old.
Exactly.
Like these soldiers, these enlisted men are all in their early 40s. And I'm like, no, y'all are too old.
Yeah. Well,
it's like watching Bing Crosby in White Christmas. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
You're too old.
You could be her grandfather. It's like somebody's Rosemary Clooney's grandfather. But but at the same time, early 40s. If you look like you were in your early 40s in the 1960s, you were probably like in your early 30s. Just based on the quality of life.
Cigarettes and booze and
yes. Well, and talking about the person that was supposed to play Mrs. Iceland, Frank Sinatra, wanted her, and I'm not sure why. I'm going to have to go back and research some more as to why it did not happen. But she was age appropriate. It was Lucille Ball who was supposed to play Mrs. Iceland, which would have been a Red Scare, wasn't it? A literal Red Scare. But that would have made a completely different movie. I would have been very interested to see how she played that too.
Just a brilliant movie. I want to watch the remake actually, because I haven't, because that's also in my head. Because it came out in 2004?
Yeah, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
And you know who plays Mrs. Iceland in that one is Meryl Streep.
Meryl Streep, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm like, the cast is ridiculous.
Yes.
So, and I've heard it's a pretty good remake, so I want to watch it.
Yes, I do too.
Thank you for listening to the Hollywood Babylonians. You have been listening to the Hollywood Babylonians. The Hollywood Babylonians is produced, edited, and hosted by Ben Burke and co-hosted by Garrett McPherson. Audio engineering by Andrew Davis with artwork by Ben Burke and Jamie Lee and research by Garrett McPherson. If you liked what you heard today, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe, and follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at the Hollywood Babylonians for more Hollywood Babylonians content. Tune in next week as we continue to discuss John Frankenheimer's 1962 political thriller, The Manchurian Candidate, with entertainment journalist Hallie Platts. Thank you for listening and have a good night.